We're in our 10th session now, and now we're looking at the divided kingdom. And we're going to look at it especially, we've already mentioned previously the Deuteronomic historian, that hypothetical editor during the time of the exile who took the history that had been compiled and gave it a very particular theological framework, which was Deuteronomic, in that it's based on the clear message of the book of Deuteronomy. More about that as we get into the class. Let me offer you a summary of where we are at this point in the story. This is according to John Bright in his book titled The Kingdom of God, and another book to recommend to you, Dale. Listen to this from John Bright. The very nature of Israel's covenant faith had given Israel a deep sense of destiny. Destiny is the people of God, and with it, the hope and confidence that God would bless the nation and establish God's own rule over Israel in the promised land. The rise of the Davidic monarchy, King David, notice Saul gets left out there, the rise of the Davidic monarchy, even though it drastically altered the tribal structure of Israel and made changes which affected every aspect of her society, changes bitterly resented by some, nevertheless, it made much of Israel's hope a reality. Under David and Solomon, God had indeed established God's people and made them great. Which leads John Bright then to ask, would all the hope of Israel and all her sense of destiny be transferred totally to the Davidic monarchy and its future? Would God's kingdom become identical to the kingdom of Israel? Well, there were many at this time who simply would not accept that identification. They, especially looking at Solomon's kingship, considered that the kingdom under Solomon was an intolerable institution and a far cry from what the ideal had been when it was very clear that there was no king for Israel but Yahweh. And Solomon had laid a heavy hand on his people. He taxed them very heavily in order to do all of his building projects. He built his palace, he built his temple, he built his court and his harem and his army, and he forced the people's labor, and he created a division between those who had and those who had not, a division that we will find as we get into the prophets, that the prophets have a very great deal to say. And furthermore, Solomon created treaties and alliances with other nations. And mostly the way he sealed these treaties was by very judiciously arranged marriages to daughters of kings, princesses. These were advantageous for Israel's trade and international prestige.
Can you speak a little louder, Jude says?
Oh, am I not loud enough?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, these treaties were sealed by marriages to princesses of the other lands. Very good for trade, very good for prestige. But Solomon didn't require his highborn wives, foreign wives, to give up their native religions. In fact, he made sure that the state, his state, I need that, Vicki. Okay, that the state would religions. So we saw when we left off last week in First Kings chapter 11, this indictment of King Solomon. In fact, you may want to turn now to First Kings chapter 11. There we find in verse 1, the indictment includes many foreign wives. In verse 4, his wives, quote, did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Reminder, when you see Lord in all capital letters, that's the stand-in for the Hebrew word YHWH. Verse 7, he built high places. Now the high places were, well, why high? With the primitive understanding of where is God, God is up above in the heavens. Therefore, if you want to get close to God, build a temple, you build a high place. He built high places for other gods, abominable gods, in the words of the text. And therefore, in chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, what? Can you find it? Anybody? Chapter 11, verses 11 and 12.
Yeah, we do.
Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, Yahweh said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. So it'll happen after his death. So one thing then that happens is that adversaries are raised up against King Solomon. Verse 14, take a look. Hadad. Verse 23, Rezon. These are adversaries against Solomon. Verse 26, Jeroboam. And after, in verse 43, Solomon dies. Do you see? Into chapter 12, we find that the kingdom comes apart. The map here, you probably can't see too much of it, but what you can see is that the two sectors of Israel are different colors. The northern kingdom is green, the southern kingdom is purple. And so we follow now the story of the divided kingdom, and the story is fairly dismal. But before we get into it, first just a reminder of the outlook of the editor of this collection that goes back starting in Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The editor is hypothetically known as the Deuteronomic historian, because the history now is told from the perspective of the book of Deuteronomy. You remember in Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Oh, by the way, not many. The Lord your God is one. Therefore, the people must not have divided loyalty. What's the first commandment? You shall have no what?
Speak up.
Other gods before you.
Okay.
You need to speak louder.
Goodness, is there someone signaling I'm not loud enough?
Yeah,
Okay. All right.
better.
And I'm going to get the microphone even closer. And all right.
Oh, that's better.
All right. Okay. Hi, Liz. Welcome. You shall have no other gods before me. And Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, calls for an intense, all-absorbing loyalty. That's what Israel owes to Yahweh only. It is very evident as they've come into Canaan that the world is filled with other gods, with idols, with statuary that claim to be deity, and Israel is not to have anything to do with any of that. And God's covenant with the people entails laws they're to obey, and if they do obey, then they will remain in possession of this land, which has been given to them by God, by Yahweh. But if they violate the covenant, then the people can anticipate difficulties, they can anticipate God's punishment, and the land will be taken away from them. What Yahweh gave, Yahweh can take away. So the order of life that's represented in Moses' speeches in the book of Deuteronomy lay out that Israel has to decide, is it going to choose the way of life or the way of death? Is it going to choose blessing or is it going to choose curse? So this land was this marvelous, undeserved gift, but it is a holy gift. It demands definitive covenant loyalty, a decision for that, loyalty to the giver of the gift. And so these books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, tell the story of what happened to Israel in light of this theology of the so-called Deuteronomic historian. Do right, you'll live, you'll be blessed. Do wrong, you'll be cursed, and you will be brought to an end. So that's the perspective. That's the Deuteronomic historian perspective. And as a consequence of the evil done by Solomon that we recounted from chapter 11, in chapter 12, we're back to chapter 12 now again of 1 Kings, the kingdom of Israel is divided. It comes apart. Solomon's policies were particularly difficult for the people of the north. I don't know if you've ever had any experience of having a headquarters in one place and the people who are close to the headquarters feel a commonality with the institution, but those who are at a distance are very suspicious. The first time I came across that, I was on the staff of the Miami Presbytery, whose headquarters were in Dayton, Ohio, but the people up north in Logan County talked about the Dayton gang. It meant that they felt alienated from the city to the south. You've got something of this here. Here is Solomon in David city of Jerusalem, which is here in the south, and the people of the north feel particularly neglected and even abused. And these, by the way, are not just a half of the 12 tribes of Israel. 10 tribes are in the north. Only 2 tribes are in the south. That's Benjamin and Judah. So a son of Solomon by the name of Rehoboam is made king. Things have not come apart yet, okay? He is made king over the entirety of the land. And Rehoboam, the new king, successor to Solomon, goes to the north, goes to Shechem, which is sort of and will be the capital of what will eventually become the northern kingdom. King Rehoboam goes to Shechem, tries to bring about unity, tries to appease the people of the north. And we're in chapter 12 now. In verses 3 and following, we find King Rehoboam meeting with the leaders of the northern area, the northern 10 tribes, and they ask him for relief from the heavy taxation. Verses 6 and following. Before he decides on his response, Rehoboam meets with a group of older men who advise him the best way to ameliorate the difficulty here is for you to become a servant of your people. And if you do that, you will win over the people's support. But verse 8 and following, be with me on chapter 12, verse 8 and following, Rehoboam doesn't follow that advice because he gets the counsel of some younger men who say, look, you got to crack the whip here. You got to show your authority here. They advise him to increase the burdens on the people, keep them under his control, and that is what he does. And the people of the north will not acknowledge that this new guy is their king. And there's a summary. Look with me in verse 19. What do you see? What do you see? Verse 19 in chapter 12. What does it say? Anybody?
And Israel has been in rebellion against the dynasty of David to this day.
Okay. The die is cast, and Rehoboam is going to reign over Judah only. For 17 years, he will be king, but just of the two tribes in purple here on the map, the two tribes of the south, the two tribes are Benjamin and Judah. And the whole region, this new subdivided nation, is called Judah, whereas the northern part retains the name of Israel. Well, the northern tribes choose their own king. And the individual they choose, you'll find this in verses 20 and following, is Jeroboam. Interesting, very similar name, right? Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Rehoboam is a son of Solomon. Jeroboam was a servant of Solomon. And prior to Solomon's death, this, by the way, is in chapter 11, verses 31 and following, Jeroboam was told by the prophet Ahijah that he would become the ruler of the 10 tribes in the north. And when Solomon, still alive when this was spoken, heard about Ahijah's words to Jeroboam, Solomon sought to kill his servant Jeroboam, and Jeroboam fled to Egypt, returned years later when Rehoboam became king after Solomon had died, and after the northern 10 tribes have rejected Rehoboam, in chapter 12, verse 20, they make Jeroboam the king of the north. So to review, after the division, the northern kingdom retains the name Israel. Israel, the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom ruled by Jeroboam. Judah, 2 tribes, the southern kingdom is ruled by Rehoboam. The northern kingdom will have as its capital Shechem. The southern kingdom retains the capital of Jerusalem, David's city. Okay, let's spend our time, and that's how the text spends its time, on the north. Jeroboam. His reign is filled with abominations. Verses 25 and following. What does he do? He one-ups the people at Sinai when they're distrustful of Moses. He builds 2 calves of gold, not just one. Verses 29 and following, Jeroboam establishes altars at Bethel and Dan, where who's worshipped? Oh, the golden calves. Chapter 13, follow along with me, an unnamed prophet confronts Jeroboam with words from the Lord God, Yahweh, about the evil he has done, and declares what God will do to punish Jeroboam and the people. And so what we see already is the trajectory. This is going to lead to the fall of Israel, the fall of the northern kingdom. It's stated, there's a forecast of it in chapter 14, but it's not going to happen for quite a number of years after a succession of mostly unworthy, unfaithful kings. So there's a summary of the reigns of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. It's in chapter 14, verse 30. Why don't I read it? There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. And then there are a number of kingships, both in the north and the south, that just don't get a lot of ink. The southern kings tend to be better, from the Deuteronomic historian's perspective, better than the northern kings. And the Deuteronomic theology is ever present. Did you get in the email a chronology? Did you happen to open it? It would be useful for you, not just for today, but as we move forward in the next several weeks to print it out, because what it will show you is the kings on the left of the southern kingdom, on the right of the northern kingdom, Judah on the left, Israel on the right, the kings all in succession running down, and in the middle, you will see the names of the prophets who are contemporaneous with the various kings. This is useful. You've got it as an email. I think you'll want to print it. So let's just take a look at how these kings that don't get a lot of ink are how they do. Okay, we're going to take a look at chapter 15, verses 25 and following, and we're introduced to King Nadab. Nadab in the north began to reign over Israel, and look at the sentence in verse 26. You're going to see that a lot. It says, "He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of his ancestor in the sin that he caused Israel to commit." Okay. Let's look at another king, the next one, Baasha, double A. Maybe it's Baasha, verses 33 and following. Take a look at verse 34. Have you seen this before? Somebody read it.
Say the chapter again.
Chapter 15, verse 14.
Or 34?
I'll read it. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, not much ink, but you get the drift. Let's take a look at the next king. His name is Omri, chapter 16, verses 21 and following. I guess he doesn't get that summation here, but here's Ahab, he does. And that is in verse 29. Verse 30 says, he did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. Okay, this is a king who will have a queen in the northern kingdom who is going to get a lot of ink. Starting in verse 29, and there it is in verse 30, more evil than all the others. But we also meet Ahab's determined opponent. King Ahab marries the daughter of a foreign king. That seems to be a pattern, does it not? And what is her name?
Jezebel.
We know her name, don't we? Immediately, Ahab erects an altar for Baal in the capital city in Samaria. And then there's another editorial comment, the second half of verse 33. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord than had all the kings of Israel who had been before him. Enter his opponent in chapter 17. And who is that?
Elijah the Tishbite.
Elijah. enter the prophet Elijah, who predicts a drought. And the drought does occur, and the drought goes on and on. It goes on for 3 years. Chapter 18. Yahweh tells Elijah to go to King Ahab, and when he does, verse 17, King Ahab knows who he's confronted with because he calls Elijah. Do you see it there? Verse 17, you troubler of Israel. But Elijah responds, next verse, what? I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. And Elijah challenges the priests of Baal. Do you remember? I think there were 450 of them, and just Elijah as a prophet of Yahweh. Elijah challenges the priests, the 450 priests of Baal, to a deity contest. It takes place on Mount Carmel. Do you remember the story? See, they're going to sacrifice a bull, right? There's a bull dedicated to the Baal, and there's the Baals, and there's a bull dedicated to Yahweh. They cut the bull up in pieces, put it on wood, and what's the challenge?
Burn it.
Whose God is powerful enough to set this pyre on fire and thus burn the sacrifice, which gods obviously want in the ancient world? They want sacrifice to have the aroma to go up to the heavens. And so the prophets of Baal, the priests of Baal, chant and scream and cry and pray and flagellate themselves, and it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. And how's the fire going for the priests of Baal?
Not.
Very good. That's what's the response. Yes, not. So Elijah pours water on his wood. How many times? 3 different times, so that the water is filling a pit around the firewood. He prays to Yahweh, and fire comes down from the heavens, and he wins. By the way, I can't tell if you've read this, but I'm not going to put you on the spot. But in verse 27 in this contest in chapter 18, Elijah mocks the priests of Baal. So he's a god, isn't he? Where is he? What's happening? Is he meditating, or is he wandered away, or is he on a journey, or perhaps is he asleep and has to be awakened? Do you see it in verse 27?
Yep.
What you do not see is the original Hebrew. And I know of no English translation that has accurately translated the earthiness of the Hebrew. We have seen the earthiness of the Hebrew before, in which Moses is allowed to see God's backside, which in the Hebrew is tush. Well, in this part, in the Hebrew, one of the taunts that Elijah hurls at the priests of Baal is, maybe your God is out taking a leak. It's never got translated into the English.
Mine says
But
that.
that's what it says in the Hebrew. With God's power clearly working through him, Elijah has proved that Yahweh is God. The Baals are not deity. And after he wins the contest, in true Deuteronomic historian narrative fashion, what does he do? He slaughters the priests of Baal. And the drought ends.
Why am I thinking it's funny?
Right. And Elijah has to flee because Queen Jezebel has sworn revenge against him. And chapter 19, keep up with me, Elijah heads for the wilderness. The wilderness is the place of testing. The wilderness is the place of doubts. And Elijah is being tested and has some doubts. God provides food. We've got a recasting of the manna experience in the wilderness here. You can see it, verses 5 and following. And also in verse 8, you see how many days he's in the wilderness. You probably don't even need to look it up to know how many days he's in the wilderness, but look it up. How many?
40 days
You
and
got
40
it.
nights.
You got it. And to what destination is he going?
Horeb.
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 Mount Horeb, depending on whether you're reading in the J, or the E histories, is the same as Sinai. He goes to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, okay? And he enters a cave where a word from the Lord God, a word from Yahweh comes to him. Now, Elijah is full of self-pity. Only I am left. Poor me, poor me. I'm the only one that's faithful to you. You see that at the end of verse 10. But verses 11 and following, Yahweh tells Elijah to go out onto the mountain of revelation, Horeb, Sinai, and there is wind, there is earthquake, there is fire, but Yahweh is not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. Where is Yahweh known in this telling?
Gentle blowing.
Small voice.
A still small voice. So if with the assurance of a quiet whisper, Elijah recognizes that he is in the presence of God and has the strength, has the assurance to go back and to confront Ahab and Jezebel further. He appoints a disciple whose name is what? Elisha. And he throws his mantle, his shawl, over the shoulders of Elisha. It's in chapter 19, verse 19. Ahab's and Jezebel's abominations continue, including chapter 21. They're stealing a vineyard from a man named Naboth, and then they arrange to have Naboth murdered so they can have his vineyard for sure, reminiscent of Nathan confronting David, the story of the rich man with the sheep, thou art the man. Anyway, at last, Yahweh's judgment comes down on Ahab, chapter 22, verses 29 and following. And Ahab is killed in battle. Jezebel's still out there. We'll learn about her end a little later, won't we? But now we leave the northern kingdom for a while and we go south to Judah, the southern kingdom, and we meet two kings, Asa and Jehoshaphat, who have been more worthy, more faithful, although they do not eliminate the high places, those shrines dedicated to other gods. Now a new king reigns over Israel following Ahab. It's Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, and verse 52, what think we're still in 19, are we? No, we're not. Oh, we've moved quite along because we had Naboth's vineyard. We are in, here we are, verse 52, the very end in chapter 22 of the book of 1 Kings. What does it say in 1 Kings 22:52? A sentence you might recognize about Ahaziah, King Ahaziah. What?
King of Israel.
Right, the king Israel, the northern kingdom. Verse 52, it says, once again, he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. See it, verse 52?
The sight of the Lord.
And now we're ready for 2 Kings, okay? Chapter 2 of 2 Kings. There's something unusual about Elijah's departure from earth. What is it?
He's assumed up, he goes up alive. What do they
He goes
call it?
up alive. He does not die. He
What do
goes
they
up
call
He
alive
gets in a
what?
chariot.
In a chariot.
A chariot.
From which a certain African-American spiritual has had its inspiration. Swing low, sweet chariot. Anyway, Elijah is remembered. Chariot, thank you. Elijah is remembered as one of the very few faithful persons in the northern kingdom. And Elijah will continue to be a symbol of Yahweh faithfulness for centuries to follow. And because he did not die, but was taken up alive into heaven, the faithful, both Jewish and Christian, believed that someday Elijah would return and would return as the forerunner to the Messiah. Who's been at a Seder meal and remembers something about the Elijah part of that story? Who remembers? Who will tell us?
I think there's an empty place set for him.
There is an empty place setting for Elijah. There is an empty chair.
That's all I know.
Awaiting
Oh, yeah.
Elijah, the one who will return when the Messianic age is about to dawn. Well, it didn't happen the last Seder, but Seder's coming up. It's coming up in a week or two. There will be, maybe Elijah will come this Seder. So Elijah has this forerunner of the Messianic age place in the Jewish narrative. And there is a figure early in the New Testament Gospels who is seen as being an Elijah figure. Who is he?
John the
John the
Baptist.
Baptist, the forerunner to the Messiah, the forerunner to Jesus, the Messiah. And it's interesting that in the next to last verse in the entire Old Testament, in other words, the next to last verse in the book of Malachi, which is the last book in the Old Testament, we find, "Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." So Elijah has this very prominent role. Let me just say, and I'm grateful to Walter Brueggemann for pointing this out, I wouldn't have caught it otherwise. Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. But in the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the Hebrew scriptures, the same collection, but organized differently, the last book of the Tanakh is not Malachi, it is 2 Chronicles. So whereas the Christian Old Testament ends with this anticipation of the forerunner to the Messiah, what a good way for the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament for Christians. In the Tanakh, the Jewish sequence of these books. It ends with Second Chronicles, which at the end of Second Chronicles, it points to the land and to Torah. The fulfillment of all this is a return to the land, which has been so important for Judaism, as you well know, ever since 1948, but well before that, and the emphasis on Torah. Anyway, Elisha, the follower of the departed on the chariot, Elijah, is a worthy successor to Elijah. And King Jehu, now we're in chapter 9 of 2 Kings. King Jehu is surprisingly, given the history of the northern kingdom, surprisingly a quite good king. And under King Jehu, Queen Jezebel gets her comeuppance at Jehu's command. It's in chapter 9, verses 30 and following. Do you remember what Jezebel's comeuppance might have been?
The dogs.
Dogs.
Well, yes, but first she's thrown off a tower, which did her in, but then the dogs take care of her remains. An inglorious ending for Queen Jezebel. Okay, Jehu's pretty good, but the norm in the north is bad kings. And in chapter 17, take a look. Chapter 17, there we meet the last of the kings of the northern kingdom, Israel. His name is Hoshea, who also, verse 2, wouldn't you know, altogether now, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the northern kingdom begins after the death of Solomon. It begins in approximately 922 BCE. It's been a succession of unfaithfulness to the covenant, unfaithfulness to Yahweh, the following after foreign gods, but the consequences have been postponed. Jeroboam succeeds to the kingship in 922, and 200 years later, in 722, a date to remember, the quiz is coming, not right away, but it's coming. In 722, the punishment for all of the northern kingdom's sins finally falls. It falls on King Hoshea, who actually had tried to work out a deal with the king of Assyria, but unfortunately, King Hoshea was a double dealer. Now, Assyria, I'm going to switch maps. We're going to look at the entire Fertile Crescent here. Assyria is what is a combination of blue and green in this big arc swath up here. Down here is the northern kingdom, which has been, is about to be overrun. Assyria conquers Israel's capital, Samaria. Assyria, the kingdom of Assyria, carries away the residents into exile in Assyria. And the Deuteronomic theological interpretation appears in, take a look, chapter 17, verses 7 and following. Why had this come down on them? Here's the Deuteronomic theological interpretation. Remember, Deuteronomic because it is choose life or death, choose blessing or curse, and they unfortunately had chosen the way of death and curse. Why? Here it is, verses 7 and following. They had sinned against Yahweh, the God of the Exodus. Oh, by the way, had it not been for the Exodus, you wouldn't even exist. They had worshiped other gods, walking in the customs of other nations. They secretly did things that were not right. They created shrines, high places, and idols to other gods. They worshiped other gods. They worshiped the Baals. They brought offerings to them. They despised the Lord's, Yahweh's laws and the covenant, and through their false religions, they themselves became false. There's the bill of particulars. That's the indictment. And these verses are central and crucial in the book of Kings. I'm going to read now in chapter 17, verses 18 and 19. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, that's the northern kingdom, and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. None was left but the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. So we're tipped off to what's ahead for the southern kingdom, are we not? These verses that I just read, 18 and 19 in chapter 17, are just a suggestion that Judah really should pay attention to what has happened to Israel. It is an object lesson from God. If you want to go the way they went, you'll act the way they did. Don't take that path. Don't choose that path. Choose the path of life. Choose the path of blessing. Okay, soon afterward, now we're in chapter 18. In the southern kingdom of named Judah, in 715 BCE, Hezekiah becomes king. And Hezekiah reigns for 29 years in what city in the south?
Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. The capital of the northern kingdom was Shechem. In Samaria, now taken over by Assyria. That's why it's green and blue here. And now the northern kingdom is infested with idols and shrines to false gods, but the capital of Judah is the holy city of Jerusalem, whose most prominent feature, in addition to the palace, is the glorious temple of God created by King Solomon. And it is said of Hezekiah, verse 3, now here's a break. He did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, like David. And you see in the next verses examples of his faithfulness. Hezekiah brought religious reform. He returned the people to the worship of the one true God. In the first month of his reign, he reopened the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. He reinstituted worship there. He removed the idols from the high places. And during his reign, Judah, name of the southern kingdom, the only existing one now, Judah faced many threats from hostile armies, but Hezekiah prevailed on the people to trust Yahweh rather than alliances with other nations. And you see in chapter 19, a record of, and here's the interesting interweaving that we're just beginning to get into, an interweaving of the Old Testament history and the Old Testament prophets. You see in chapter 19, there's a record here of King Hezekiah consulting with the prophet Isaiah. It signals that when we begin our study of the prophets, which we will begin next Wednesday evening, we're going to be doubling back on the same historical period, but now we'll be seeing it starting next week through the lenses of the prophetic imagination. Chapter 20. Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, becomes critically ill, but prays to God for healing. And Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, returns, assures the king that his prayers are being answered. He's going to recover. But Isaiah also tells him, verses 16 and following, that one day Judah is going to fall also. Judah is going to fall not to Assyria, but to Babylon. And the people are going to be taken into captivity, just as their northern neighbors had been taken. Along comes another exemplary king of Judah, even more than Hezekiah, and his name is Josiah. Chapter 21. In between these two good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, there are two others who, oh, by the way, did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. That's all about they have to say for Manasseh and Ammon. But Josiah, now we're in chapter 22. He becomes the 16th king of Judah when he's only 8 years old. He remains king for 31 years, and he is a reformer par excellence. His reforms are even more extensive than Hezekiah's were. Josiah initiates a restoration of the temple in order to return it to the holy place it was built to be. And in the process of restoration, chapter 22, verses 3 and following, a book of the law, a book of the religious law is found, and it is read to King Josiah. Verse 11, as an act of repentance, he tears his clothes, a sign of his sincerity, his mourning. He turns to a prophetess, Huldah, asking, what do these words mean? And she interprets to King Josiah the law of the Lord God, the law of Yahweh. And here's what scholars believe about this. What they believe is that what was found somewhere in the depths of the temple was a form of the book of Deuteronomy. Chapter 23.
I have a question.
You bet.
The northern Israel, and they're all taken and away.
They're taken into exile, right?
Exactly. But then, and Judah, when they're taken into exile, are the Israelis still there? Did they join
They are
them?
taken to different places. It is the empire of Assyria that captures the northern kingdom, Israel. It will be the empire of Babylon, which is a successor to the empire of Assyria, who conquers Jerusalem, destroys Jerusalem, and then takes the captors from the southern kingdom to Babylon. And of course, our scripture lesson last Sunday was about that very exile. By the rivers of Babylon, we wept.
Mhm.
But they go to a different place, conquered by a
But
different
they're all
empire.
Still, they're all, the whole bunch are still captive.
That's correct.
Okay.
And as best we know, not everybody was taken out of the land, either of Israel or of Judah, but the leaders were. The people who could have organized and been a threat to the empire that captured them.
Yeah.
In fact, Vicki and I, some years ago, were in Poland to hear about when the Germans took Poland, and then the Russians took Poland, and then the Germans took Poland. And every time, who they went after were the political leaders, the military leaders, and the intellectual leaders. That's who were wiped out. And probably not wiped out, but taken into exile is the story that we have here.
Okay.
So the Josiah reform, chapter 23, how we doing on time? Not bad, but I'll keep moving. Josiah, King Josiah gathers all the people and the leaders in Jerusalem for a reading from the book that had been found, a reading from some form of the book of Deuteronomy. And Josiah makes a covenant renewal, a covenant with God, and he institutes a thoroughgoing purge of all kinds of compromises with paganism. He throws out idolatrous priests. He confiscates idols, statuary, beats them into dust. He removes the altars from the high places to foreign gods. He breaks them into pieces. He restores true worship in the temple. It makes you realize between Hezekiah and Josiah, there must have been a great deal of backsliding in the temple under the intervening two kingships. He restores true worship to the temple. In fact, Josiah even abolishes shrines to Yahweh in outlying towns, so there can be a kind of centralized control for the orthodoxy of the worship of Yahweh in the temple in Jerusalem. And Josiah reinstitutes the festival of Passover, the keeping of Passover, as required in the book that had been read aloud, the book of Deuteronomy, a festival supposedly that hadn't been kept since the time of the judges. So Josiah is the best of the kings, and there's a prophet active during the time of Josiah's reign, and this prophet, did you notice, do you know, or shall I just tell you, is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah in chapter 22, we can get to that next week if you want. Jeremiah in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 22, expresses unbounding admiration for King Josiah. So the interweaving is interesting. But Josiah is killed in a battle at a particular location, Liz. The location is at Megiddo. At Megiddo. That's where the battle was. Remember why? Because Megiddo is in this very important route between the empires. And sure enough, that's where the battle occurs. Take a look. It's chapter 23, verse 29. There's the battle for the control of this corridor. Josiah is killed at Megiddo while seeking to protect his people from the armies of the southern empire, of the armies of Egypt. They're either coming from the south or they're coming from the north, but they come right through. And the next kings of Judah, who are the last kings of Judah, Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim, guess what? They did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And Jeremiah, the prophet, is very active in criticizing Judah under their rule. And here's another date to remember. And in 587 BCE, in 587, Jerusalem and Judah are conquered by Babylon. Back to this big map again. Whoops. Are we going the wrong? I went the wrong way. We've got Palestine in the time of Jesus here. I went the wrong direction. Okay, come back. Yes, okay. You can probably just barely see it, but you'll notice there's a blue streak down here and a yellow streak up here. Well, and then a green in between. That's simply because, you put blue and yellow together, what do you get?
Green.
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 The Assyrian Empire is blue and green.
Gesundheit.
Gesundheit. The
Oh,
Assyrian Empire is blue and green. Terry, you are going to be memorialized in the YouTube version of this because whenever there's a noise, you are right on camera. So you'll get to see your sneeze if you want to watch yourself later. The blue and green is Assyria. Assyria is then conquered by Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire is yellow and green. Yellow and green. And in 587 BC, oh, did I mention that's an important date? Yes, it is. In 587 BC, Jerusalem and Judah are conquered by the empire of Babylon. And the Babylonian army is the army of King Nebuchadnezzar. And how do they get through to the wall, the walled city of Jerusalem? The way every invading army gets to Jerusalem, it's through the north wall. If you've been to Jerusalem, and some of us have, I believe, you will know there's a deep valley on I get my hand. The south, east, and west have two valleys that converge, and you just can't attack from there. But from the north, it's clear sailing to the north wall. And that's the way Jerusalem has always been vulnerable, even in the Crusades that we heard, unfortunately, a bit about 2 weeks ago. The Babylonian army of King Nebuchadnezzar breaches the north city wall, pours through the breach, and what do? They destroy the Temple of Solomon. They burn the holy city. And they carry off many of the population of Judah into exile in Babylon. So all of the symbols of Yahweh's covenant with the people have now been wiped out. And they have to ask, does this mean that the covenant with God has been wiped out? It's going to seem like that because they are going to be in exile for 50 years. And that's not too hard to remember. 587 BCE, did I mention that date? I think I did.
Yeah.
And they return from exile in approximately 538, 537 BCE. So the consequences of the people's making bad decisions, bad choices, not choosing life and blessing, but choosing death and curse by their disloyalty, which Moses had laid out before them before they entered this land. The consequences are now terribly obvious, but they'd been told. They'd been told. If the covenant is violated, the people can expect punishment and that the land will be taken from them. What Yahweh gave, Yahweh can also take away. And now there is no going back. Except we will. Except we will go back because for the next couple sessions, we are going to go back over the same historical period. But now we're going to look at it not from the histories of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. We are going to look at it from the vantage point of the prophets and their take on this period of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the period of the divided kingdom. So it isn't really back to 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's 1st Kings 12 to the end of 2nd Kings. And what I would suggest before next Wednesday is that you read Jeremiah, because we'll dip into Jeremiah quite a bit. But what we are going to do next week
Glory
is
worship.
Pardon?
No,
What we're
sorry.
going- Yes, Esther? What we're going to do next week is hear the thesis of one of the very first books that Walter Brueggemann ever wrote. It is
Oh,
called The Prophetic Imagination. It was with that book that he really hit the scene of theological education and the Christian church. And we realized here is a voice to be contended with. This is somebody we need to listen to. I will introduce the prophetic imagination according to Walter Brueggemann, in which we'll look particularly at Jeremiah. Okay, that was an awful lot. Let's pause and see in the last 5 or so minutes if you have any comments or questions. Let's
just
talk.
one comment. I saw in the news a couple of days ago, they found another Dead Sea Scroll. Have you heard of that at all, or any opinion? Or
I also saw the news. I expect that others did as well. Haven't heard anything about what the manuscripts are, but I do remember that when the original Dead Sea Scrolls were found in and around Masada, and where the Essenes would have maintained scriptures. Essenes, we will learn more about the Essenes when we get into the New Testament. There were some scrolls there that were earlier, particularly some fragments of the prophet Isaiah, earlier than any other scrolls that scholars had yet had access to and translated. So it improved our understanding of the earliest Old Testament. There is a chance that there will be some very early manuscripts there that will again improve our understanding of the text.
exciting.
It is exciting. One of the things you might remember that I think I said on our very first class about how the Bible was put together, and talked about the fact that for centuries, the only authoritative English translation was the King James Version. Now that translation was done in 1611. And when the Revised Standard Version was introduced in 1948 with the New Testament, in 1954 with the Old Testament, there was much resistance from the traditional Christian church and its leadership, because we would been raised on the King James Version. We believed, if it was good enough for St. Paul, it ought to be good enough for us. Well, by the way, St. Paul did not read in the Bible in English, but here was the deal. If it's a really good translation, as the New Revised Standard Version that we are using is an outstanding translation, very true to the ancient original manuscripts. The interesting thing is, the more recent the translation, the more likely, the more ancient and authoritative the sources. Because biblical archaeology in 1611 had not found some of the more ancient scrolls that had been found between 1611 and 1948.
Right.
So it's very exciting and promising, and we'll see what we learn after they begin to examine the contents.
When did you say the New Revised Version came into existence?
The Revised Standard Version, leave the new out. The Revised Standard Version, the New Testament was published in 1948, I think, and the Old Testament was published in 1954. The one we are using, the New Revised Standard Version, I believe, was copyrighted 1990. Because there were more ancient manuscripts, including, Liz, the original Dead Sea Scrolls for some of the Old Testament fragments. And also, the English language had changed, and there was an attempt to be more inclusive in language about human beings. So as you have done it under one of the least of these, my brethren or my brothers, my brethren was in the King James, my brothers, in the Revised Standard Version. In the New Revised Standard Version, I don't know exactly, but I think it says, as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you have. That was the kind of thing that you will find in the New Revised Standard Version.
1989.
1989 is the copyright. Anything else before we call it a night?
Yeah, a question.
Yes.
Prior to the split of the 12 tribes, and you have the 2 tribes that formed Judah and the rest of Israel, what was the name for the whole area? Was it Israel?
I think we have, yes, called it Israel. Well, the fact of the matter is that the name Israel has quite a story, doesn't it? The word Israel originally is the new name for Jacob after his wrestling with the angel of God, or wrestling with God, and he's given a name, and Israel means he who contends with, or he who wrestles with God.
Oh.
Israel, i.e. Jacob, is the father of 12 sons. The 12 sons become the progenitors, the leaders of the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
So they're the people of Israel, which in effect means the people of Father Jacob, whose name is also Israel. Then, so they are a people, then they move into the land, and the land is the promised land. The land is the land of Canaan, the land, and eventually, because it is the people of Israel who are in it, the land becomes, the name of the people is then given to the land. So it is Israel who are the people we are following who move into this land, and eventually the people's name, Israel, becomes the name of the land. But then in, what is it, 922, with a separation, as the northern kingdom says, we're out of here, they retain the name of Israel. And the southern 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, retain the name of one of the tribes, and that is of Judah.
Okay.
Just a
Ken?
reminder about schedule. We will be together next Wednesday for Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, and you'll be reading in Jeremiah. Then we will not meet the following Wednesday. It is the Wednesday of Holy Week, but we will then resume on Wednesday, I think it's April 7, in which we'll get into some of the major prophets and minor prophets. Did I tell you why they're major and minor? I think I did. Major prophets just because they're long books. Minor prophets because they're just short books.